In this video, I want to discuss the ventricles of the brain. The ventricles are fluid-filled chambers within the cerebrum of the brain. Now we have technically 4 ventricles in the brain. We have 2 lateral ventricles. We have a 3rd ventricle and a 4th ventricle, but they are all interconnected. In this model, I can see this large curling ram's horn type structure represents one of the lateral ventricles. That lateral ventricle begins in the frontal lobe of the brain as the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, and it circles down, and as it's coming down, it's coming a little bit lateral, and then it sweeps forward again as the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. That is found within the temporal lobe of our brain. This portion was passing through the parietal lobe of the brain, and as we pass the occipital lobe of the brain, we send out what is called the posterior horn of that lateral ventricle. So an anterior horn, a posterior horn, and an inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Now if I rotate this so that we can look at it from a straight-on view, we can see that it does move laterally as it goes back and then comes back forward and medially again. Right down the middle of this model, we can see what is called the 3rd ventricle, and the 3rd ventricle is connected to the 2 lateral ventricles by a little area known as the Interventricular Foramen. Now on this model, we must realize that this was a fluid-filled space within the brain, so this is a negative image. We have taken that fluid and essentially solidified the fluid and removed the actual tissue. So you're looking at a negative image. So what you see here represents the fluid of the ventricles. The ventricles are now gone. Between these 2 lateral ventricles and the 3rd ventricle, there's a very narrow area right here known as the interventricular foramen. The interventricular foramen, sometimes called of Monroe. And then we have a midline 3rd ventricle. We also have a midline 4th ventricle. I'm going to take a posterior view of this. We can see the 4th ventricle a little bit better. Here's a posterior view of our 4th ventricle. Now the 4th ventricle is connected to the 3rd ventricle by what is known as the Cerebral Aqueduct, sometimes known as the Cerebral Aqueduct of Sylvius. So 2 lateral ventricles, a midline 3rd ventricle connected to the lateral ventricles by the interventricular foramen, a midline 4th ventricle which was connected to the midline 3rd ventricle by the Cerebral Aqueduct, or the Aqueduct of Sylvius. The 4th ventricle is then continuous with the spinal cord via the central canal, but we can also see the 4th ventricle widens into what are called lateral recesses. Cerebrospinal fluid is made within the ventricles of the brain, but we want to get that cerebrospinal fluid outside the brain and spinal cord, deep within the meninges, or at least within the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. At the ends of the lateral recesses, we have what are known as the lateral apertures. That is where the cerebrospinal fluid can leave the ventricle system and become a subdural fluid. Now there are other apertures associated with the 4th ventricle, but they are not represented on this model. So there we see a good 3-dimensional aspect of the ventricles of the brain. Realize 4 ventricles, 2 lateral ventricles, a midline 3rd ventricle, and a midline 4th ventricle, all interconnected.